So you might have experienced a sense of deja vu watching Mansion House last night, for those who tuned in at 9 p.m. on LinkedIn. And that's because creating a package of reforms like the Edinburgh reforms or the Leeds reforms is a bit like playing supermarket sweep. Put your arm on a shelf and see how much you can swipe off and put into your trolley. And that means telling the regulators and telling the Treasury, maybe you could speed this up a little bit, maybe you could delay this a bit, and maybe we just re-announce some things as well. So the central plank, and indeed the central plank of the government's demand side reforms to try to foster a retail investment culture were the targeted support measures. I mean, we first read about those in an AGBR discussion paper in 2023, and the proposals were published last month. Mortgage affordability rules, so things like mooting using rental payments as part of affordability assessments and looking at things like LTI. Some of those details were first published in February. But there were new things as well. And actually, we can divide the announcements made last night into things primarily focused on growth, things primarily looking at international competitiveness of the UK as a jurisdiction, and things just looking at instilling confidence in the sector and in regulatory consistency. So on targeted support, the Chancellor is putting a lot of stock into more consumers owning stocks and shares, preferably UK equities. But if we look at the regulator's own behavioural research, it's notoriously difficult to get people to engage in their finances at all, let alone look at mobilising capital out of cash savings, which is one of the reasons the Chancellor's announced a Tell SID 2.0, a new campaign backed by industry, secretariat managed by the Investment Association, with the regulators providing advice. Again, this is important, and it does require a whole industry and government campaign to talk about the risks of not investing. But if we look into the details of targeted support, there are some issues that we may need to overcome when we evaluate the programme, probably towards the end of 2027, beginning of 2028. At the moment, there's no obligation on providers to suggest any products or services that they or associated companies don't offer. Instead, they'll just have to provide some sort of disclaimer, words to the effect of there may be a product offered by someone else that might be more effective, but the wording of that hasn't been agreed yet. That's still subject to consultation. And as I said, given the behavioural research suggests it's very difficult to get people to engage. Just look at how notoriously difficult it is to get people to switch and the number of campaigns that regulators have run. It's going to be difficult without looking at open market competition to perhaps get people to look beyond the current service provider. The Chancellor's commitment to look at ring fencing at pace. So a report that's going to be, or a review that's going to be led from the Treasury and reviewed by the EST. Now, the language around the ring fencing review that's coming out of the PRA and the Bank of England is interesting. I mean, Andrew Bailey, Governor of the Bank of England, was asked last night about some of the proposals that were made and did say it's not a zero-sum game between deregulation and financial stability, but actually, rules are timely. There is a period of time that's passed since the global financial crisis. It is right to look at the suitability of those rules, particularly in light of Brexit and onshoring rules. But the bank and the PRA have both been more bullish than the FCA when it comes to talking about the red lines that they have, particularly around financial stability. And Andrew Bailey, even as recently as a week ago at the Treasury Select Committee, talked about the downsides to looking at the ring fencing regime. So this could potentially be, depending on how bullish the Treasury want to be in their review, a flashpoint between her, the Governor of the Bank of England, and the Chief Executive of the PRA. Next was the eagerly and slightly longer than some anticipated awaited arrival of Financial Services Industrial Strategy. So part of this document just captures reforms that were announced last night by the Treasury, but some of them do provide a lot more certainty for sectors. So particularly payments, actually just being clear about the UK's commitment to looking at things like DLT, to looking at digital innovation in payments, to commit into open banking, talk about the appetite for open finance and the use of new open data sets that have recently been provided for in legislation. That's important to have there, as well as the government's desire to foster regional financial services hubs throughout the UK. Now, one of the main takeaways from last night was the Chancellor's ongoing desire to regulate for growth, not just for risk. But we have to be mindful that risk isn't just investment risk, it's also political risk. So two of the big demand-side initiatives last night, targeted support and mortgage affordability. Now, on targeted support, the FCA can emphasise that this isn't particularly personalised, that this is supposed to be for cohorts of people like the particular consumer being targeted, and you can be clear about what protections are available. But if you have one constituent writing to a backbench MP and complaining, they may think, okay, well, my office can forward it to the FCA, they can forward that letter to the Treasury, they can explain the regulatory situation. If you get 100 constituents who form a consumer support group who argue that there was regulatory failure in this case, that they were induced to invest at the behest of the new Tell Sid campaign, targeted support, or even simplified advice, and feel like they have lost out and that they're owed redress, it becomes harder for a backbench MP not to push to represent them and to try to plead their case. If you have 100,000 consumers as part of a consumer redress event backed by a consumer group or a media outlet, it becomes even harder for the EST to refuse to have a meeting with those backbenchers who quite rightly want to represent their constituents. So there will always be a degree of political risk, which is one of the reasons why the FCA have been calling for failure metrics, because they're not entirely confident that the political cover they currently enjoy is necessarily sustainable. Similarly, the mortgage affordability assessments. The regulators have been very clear in appearances at the select committees and in speeches that it does increase the risk of repossessions and of people failing to be able to meet their mortgage payments. The discussion paper that the FCA issued was framed as that, a discussion paper. It said we need a societal debate about risk appetite and whether we're willing to implement these reforms. Even if the reforms are implemented, people may have their homes repossessed. And once again, you're in a situation where backbench MPs will want to point the finger and will look at the extent to which regulators and firms may be held accountable. This is something the Chancellor needs to bear in mind, particularly given that the PLP has demonstrated that it can overturn Treasury decisions, whether on welfare spending or perhaps financial services policy. Now, if you're at a loss over summer recess and trying to think about how you or your organisation can navigate tax spend decisions in the budget that we're expecting end of October, beginning of November, party conference season, and going into 2026, big elections in Scotland and Wales, do get in touch.